Okay, it's 1 minute past 2:30, so I think we might get started. Well, let's begin with good afternoon and welcome to our final coaching webinar for 2022. We made it to the end of the year. I don't know about you guys, but I'm just ready for a holiday. And for those of you who haven't joined our previous webinars, my name's Kate Golby and I'm the Senior Behavioral Analyst here at GRIST, and I'll be the MC for today. Now, for the last webinar of the year, we're taking things a little differently, taking a slightly different approach, and instead of digging down into specific practical coaching discussions, we'll take a step back and have a look at coaching a little bit more broadly. And who better to do this with and lead our conversation than our very own GRIST Managing Director, Peter Grist, who will be joining us today. I'm also joined as always by my colleague and GRIST Director, Caitlin Ziegler, who will be digging into why Peter is so passionate about establishing positive coaching culture and hopefully unearthing some insights that you can take away with you today. Now, before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. We want you to interact with us today, so please use the Q&A button on the control panel, and there you can ask questions and make comments for Peter. We'll have a full Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please type them as you're going along so we don't forget to ask them. All right, I'm going to stop sharing now. So let's get into it. A bit about Peter. So Peter Grist has more than 20 years of experience working with customer-focused organisations with the aim of improving coaching and leadership capabilities. Peter likes to get things done. His action-oriented mindset is one of the reasons clients love working with him, and his preference for solving problems and making a difference to the lives of the people he works with has kept him with GRIST since the early days. He's also been fascinated by how businesses work and loves the variety that comes with being a consultant. So Peter, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
No worries. Thank you, Kate.
Pleasure. Great. Now, despite the average millennial staying at a job for under 3 years, I have been working with GRIST for over 13 years now. So I am well versed on everything about GRIST, but I'm sure most of the people here aren't as familiar with our business. So before we dive too deeply into your coaching philosophy and what excites you about coaching, how about you just tell us a little bit about GRIST?
No problem. Thank you, Kate. And thanks for being with us for so long. It's fantastic. Look, simply put, GRIST is a change management consultancy that specialises in the people side of change. So wherever an organisation is looking for a different outcome or it wants to change its performance by changing the behaviour of people, that's where we come in. So it really doesn't matter what the objective is that the organisation's trying to achieve. It could be increased engagement of their teams. It could be increased productivity of a team, maybe a sales team, or it could be even landing a new compliance framework. It doesn't really matter if that objective can be achieved by changing the behaviour of people, then that's where we come in. And we like to sort of term that as our role is to simplify change and inspire learning so that organisations and the people within them can actually thrive. And there's some real strong beliefs that we have about the way organisations work. You know, we really believe that conversations are the lifeblood of organisations. Think about all the conversations that happen in organisations over any one day and over a year. You know, there's thousands and thousands of them. And if we can improve the quality of all of them just a little bit, we know that we can achieve really big outcomes. And that links to the second piece, which is we're really fascinated by how concentrating on tiny little changes actually produces really big results. And you can accelerate the amount of change that you get through an organisation or in capability by really breaking it down to the smallest. And then finally, we absolutely believe that leaders are the single biggest influence on people and performance inside organisations. So sum it all up, we're about making every conversation count, whether it's us internally, whether it's our clients talking to each other or coaching or talking to a customer. But very much, I hope that's what today will be. It'll be one of those conversations that counts, and that everyone can take something little away and put it into practice and get that little bit better.
Thanks, Peter. Let's launch into it. We've got a whole host of questions to put to you today on building that coaching culture. And that's really the crux of what we want to talk about, how to build that in our organisations. But tell me first, why are you so passionate about building a coaching culture and such an advocate for a leader as a coach?
Yeah, well, there's our entire history of doing programs with organisations and seeing how you can bring an organisation alive, engage people and deliver outstanding results by getting more coaching happening in an organisation. And as I mentioned before, we're about helping organisations achieve objectives by changing the behaviour of people. And we know that one of the best ways you can do that is to run this leader and coach model and to have really good coaching happening in the organisation. But there's also a couple of really well-known theories that I think speak to why it's so critical. The first one I'd like to sort of talk about today is the 70-20-10 learning and development theory. Now, I know a lot of people on this call will have already come across that theory, but just basically it talks about where people actually learn and how they learn. And the 70 is about learning on the job. 70% of everything we learn is by doing and having a crack. 20 relates to coaching and learning from others. And then it lands on 10%, which is the learning that we do more formally in a training room. So you can see from that model, which, I think everyone knows from their own personal experience is actually right. We learn by doing and having a go. So 90% of everything that we actually learn and change that we make through learning either happens through coaching and with others or on the job. So you can imagine a frontline leader who is acting as a coach has got a huge influence on that 90%. So many organisations focus far too much time on the 10 and then they leave the rest to chance. So, leaders can really help bring that to life. And then the other theory that we really work a lot with, which is, I think, GRIST's favourite motivational theory. There's a million out there. This was self-determination theory by a couple of guys called Ryan and Dietschy way back in the 70s. And it was really a turning point in an understanding of motivation from sort of the science saying that everyone was motivated by external motivators. And this was a real shift to understand that, a lot of people are actually more motivated by intrinsic motivators, yeah? And self-determination theory, which we know just works from our everyday life and the work we do, has three key elements, which is autonomy, mastery, and relatedness. So, autonomy, when people feel like they have some control over what they're doing and how they're going about it, we know that they perform better. If they feel like they're getting better at what they do or they're good at what they do, that's a huge driver of motivation. And then finally, relatedness is about working with and for others. So it's about that connection to something greater than just myself. So if you think about a really good coach leader and how they can impact, well, firstly, they can bring teams together and create a higher purpose. Fantastic. They can certainly work on mastery and help people feel like they're getting better. And then a good coach should be giving people autonomy on how they get there. So it's almost like voila, you've got that good coach pulling each one of those levers of one of the most reliable motivational tools that you'll see out there. So that's why I'm pretty passionate about it, Caitlin.
Oh, I love that. And self-determination theory, I know we've talked a little bit about that in some of our past webinars because we're such a fan. And it's that autonomy piece. Well, getting all those three components together is always so hard for a leader and a coach to actually master themselves, getting that into their coaching. I think that's fantastic. You mentioned before, we're all about change. I would really like to talk about change fatigue because we've heard a lot about change fatigue, particularly over this year and the last few years with COVID. How can a coaching culture help with change fatigue?
Yeah, it's a great question. Pretty much every organisation we work with is talking about change fatigue in some form or another. What really changed my thinking a little bit about this was a conversation with one of our clients, and they'd been hearing this concept of change fatigue everywhere. So they decided not to just accept it, but try and really go in and find out what was truly going on. So they asked everyone a whole series of questions about the amount of change. And what they found was that people weren't necessarily overwhelmed, or they weren't sick of the amount of change that was coming down the line. What they were really sick of was change done badly. Yeah. So, people have an enormous ability to change and take on new and different ways of doing things. But if it's not delivered correctly, that can become really annoying. Yeah. And so back to the initial point about sort of this coaching culture piece, we see change in organisations. So, we work on probably two critical areas, which is change and capability. But in an organisation, never the twain shall meet. You've got the change team over here, and they're designing the change and feeding it down. And you've got the capability and learning and development talking about everything that needs to be done over here. But ultimately, all of that comes together at that frontline team. Yeah, that change often has to be absorbed and put into practice. Yeah. But what we see is that that's often where the roadblock is. It's the block in the bottom of the funnel. And if that change can't be delivered efficiently through that frontline team, the whole thing starts to back up, and then people get change fatigue. So imagine if you've got a really good leader as coach sitting in that leader of that frontline team, and they can take that change and that learning and development, and they can execute more quickly. We know that we can get change through organisations more quickly. If we do that, then this thing called change fatigue starts to become less of a problem.
Yeah, I really love that thinking, because then for me as the coachee, it's actually not really any difference between whether I'm building capability or whether I'm coping with new change or new process. It's actually all the same thing if it's being filtered through that consistent coaching lens. It makes it a lot easier for me as a user, at the end user piece, to see what my role is in implementing that change or building that capability.
Yeah. It's interesting, Caitlin. Most organisations, though, there's not that understanding that when it gets down the bottom, it's the same thing. It's actually just getting someone to change their behaviours. So it feels like to the frontline team and the team leader, like it's coming at me from all directions, and there's no consistency across them. So I think there's a lot organisations could do to bring change and capability initiatives together at a higher level in the organisation, so they come down to the frontline team as one thing that needs to change behaviour.
Yeah, I love that. So we've touched on coaching culture, why you're passionate about it, Peter, but how do you do it? How do you create a coaching culture?
Yeah, it's probably, that's a good point. There's a lot of things that will impact whether you'll end up with a sustainable, productive coaching culture inside your organisation. So we've really, based on all our experience over the years, have really synthesised all of that down to concentrating on three things. Now, we're not saying these three things are the only things, but what we are saying is if you make significant progress in these three key areas, you will be much closer to having a really good coaching culture. And those three things are frequency. This is about the amount and the consistency of coaching, and really working out what is the right amount of coaching that's required inside your organisation. The second one is focus. So this is the art of translating organisational objectives or scorecards, or even individual objectives, into behaviour. Like, the only thing we can change is the behaviour. We can't change the result unless we change the behaviour. But so many leaders really struggle to make that translation between the objective and the behaviour. And even when they're thinking they're talking about behaviours, they're still talking about outputs, yeah? And then the final one is quality. So it's the quality of those conversations that are happening, those coaching conversations. And here, when I talk about coaching conversations in this webinar, I'm not just talking about the traditional one-on-one. We're talking about team coaching, we're talking about team meetings, we're talking about stand-ups, and we're talking about, say, where you might take someone out of their job for a while and go and have a one-on-one conversation with them. So all of those conversations that are about taking objectives and turning them into coachable behaviours is what we're talking about. So they're the three main elements, yeah?
Yeah. Focus, frequency, quality. Yeah. And it's a nice summary of just those, keeping it simple about what could actually help you have a starting point. But thinking about that then as a starting point, you've got three things there where they're actually quite big things to tackle. Where would you start if you were going to tackle one of those to start building that coaching culture?
Yeah, well, we always say frequency first. So there's really little point putting much effort into improving the focus and the quality of the conversation if you don't have time to do them anyway. Yeah. So and there's another reason, because the frequency bit is the foundation of a coaching culture. There's a great piece of work by a guy called Edgar Schein, who's one of the foremost experts on organisational culture. And he set out many years ago to do a piece of work to try and understand what were the biggest impacts on culture inside organisation. And happily for us, he came up with this top 10. The fascinating thing about the top 10 is the first 5 factors are all about leaders. So all about leaders and what they do. So we know that the top 5 from Edgar Schein are all based on what leaders do. But the very first one is about what leaders pay attention to. So the number one indicator of culture inside an organisation is what leaders pay attention to. So if you're going to try and create a coaching culture, then you better have leaders paying attention to it. And the simplest way they can pay attention to it is to actually lock it into their diary and actually make sure they get it done. So you can imagine the message that that then sends to an organisation. If my busy leader always has time set aside for me and to coach me and spend time with me and the team, helping us understand what behaviours we need to change so that we can drive our performance. So, you know, a great indication of what you value is where you choose to spend your time. It's probably the one thing that you can really hold on to that holds true in pretty much any situation. Mm-hmm. So if a leader consistently devotes time and deliberately and intentionally has it in their diary, there is your number one tick as towards, you know, ending up building a coaching culture.
I want to challenge you on that one, Peter, around the frequency, and because I know we've all experienced that sort of pushback from leaders to go, yes, I know it's important, but I've got to get this stuff done too. How do you? I have heard you challenge leaders in the past about where they spend their time and what they actually prioritise. How do you talk them through about, you know, blocking that time out and protecting it, and then challenging them to, if they have to, how do they communicate if they have to cancel that time or if they have to move it? How do you deal with that, Peter?
Yeah, there's a challenge I always have a bit of fun with people when we're in the room, and I challenge leaders and I say, do you ever have to, you know, you have catch-ups with your team? Do you ever have to counsel them? And everyone sort of puts up their hand and goes, yeah, of course we do. You know, there's times when things just don't go right and you have to counsel them. So what I say to them is I say, well, next time you have to do that, my challenge to you is you need to walk up to the person that you're going to cancel the coaching with, which is you in this case, Caitlin. And you need to go up and say, I'm really sorry, Caitlin, I'm going to cancel our coaching session today because I've actually got something more important to do than coach you. Now, normally that gives a little bit of a laugh from everyone, and they have a little bit of a nervous laugh. And I go, well, do you say that? And they go, no. And then I say, well, what normally happens? And they go, well, normally the person goes, oh, it's okay. I know you're really busy. And we all sort of make each other feel good and we walk away. Yeah. But the message you are sending, if you do that, is exactly what I just said. I can't coach you today because I've got something more important to do. So there's one little way of trying to reframe your thinking about the importance of coaching. Yeah. But the other thing I think, Caitlin, is what we need to do is sometimes leaders' organisational design is not correct either. And it's not all on that individual leader. Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well.
Yeah, well, I've got another question on frequency, because I do think the frequency bit's the hardest nut to crack, really, when you're thinking about the coaching and building coaching culture. So how do you know when enough coaching is the right amount? How do you sort of judge what the frequency should be for your organisation?
There's no fixed rules on this one, and obviously this relates to the experience of the team or the team member, you know, how long they've been in your organisation, but also how big a shift it is between their current performance and the performance that is required for them to be successful in their role. So they're all things that we need to take into account. But one thing I can tell you that it shouldn't be based on, which it often is how much time the leader actually has. And let me just unpack that a little bit for you. So, you know, we go into organisations, there's usually some sort of performance challenge. And we go and have a bit of a look around, we duck under the hood, we find that there's, you know, there's meant to be a certain amount of coaching going on. It's probably a little bit low in the first place. And then we go and look at what's actually going on. We see that often it's been cancelled and it's just not been, the coaching is just not taking place. And then we sort of go, well, you know, why are you doing the amount of coaching that you're doing? And it always comes back to, I'm too busy and we're too busy, we've got all these other things to do and the leader doesn't have enough time. It usually comes back to that. Or it can also come back to obviously greater service if we're talking and there's some sort of crisis in a contact centre. But the interesting thing is when we ask how it was set up in the first place, what they'll say is, well, that's just the amount of time that the leader has, and the role description and the spans of control have all been designed for some reason, but they haven't been designed based on the amount of coaching and development that team actually needs in order to achieve its objective. There's usually no connection to the two, yeah? So we might go, oh, they want to take cost out of the business, so we just expanded the span of control to 15. Well, did you think about the impact that would have on the ability to coach and develop so you hit your objectives? No, we didn't take that into account. Well, no wonder you're not actually achieving the objectives. So the key point I would have there, Caitlin, is you may have the right frequency and all the right amount, and all you need to do is work on quality and focus. But I'd challenge yourself first to go back, look at the objectives you're setting for your team, look at their capability, look at the gap in capability, and then make an assessment about how much coaching is from them. And then you design the frontline team leader role and the spans of control. Now, that won't always happen, but that's thinking should be at least in that process.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. But let me be devil's advocate again on that one and go, let's say I've designed the perfect cadence that I think is going to work for my team and it's going to meet what they need to achieve. So I've designed it, we've got it ready there, but getting leaders to implement it, I imagine it is a whole different scenario. So what are your tips about that and then getting that cadence implemented once I've designed it?
Yeah, that's an incredibly tough one. And I think you've actually hit on what is probably the major challenge in this whole process, is getting that consistent cadence of coaching and development and not having it being taken away for every other reason other than what our people actually need, This is interesting. We've done many programs. I'm probably talking a little bit more in the past before we had all the tools that we've got available now, but in the past, we've done programs where we've absolutely demonstrated. So we're in there, we're working with the teams, we get the leaders in the right spot, we improve their capability, they improve the capability of their teams, we get amazing results, and everyone is amazingly happy with the program, and then, as can happen when consultants are in, the organisation wants to take it over themselves, we go away, we might come back in 18 months, 2 years' time, magically the coaching's evaporated and they're sort of almost starting to struggle with some of the problems we had before. So we need to understand that there is something about organisations that inexorably drags people leaders away from their teams towards operational tasks. And I think everyone on this webinar would have some examples of that. So we've got to find ways to keep hold leaders accountable and to encourage them to keep coaching their team on a consistent basis over a long period of time if we want to really have that culture and the performance that we're looking for. So there's a couple of points that I'd make there. If you make coaching part of what all levels of leadership do inside an organisation, that will go a significant way towards maintaining it. So frontline leaders, yes, we want them coaching the front line, but they need coaching themselves. So what is the rhythm for the leaders of leaders? We need to get them in and we need to hold them accountable. But the leaders of leaders, they need some help too. So who's coaching them? So if we can get that cascading accountability and role modelling of coaching coming down the line, then I'll guarantee it'll be much easier to keep that frontline team actually coaching. And then the other thing I'd say is that most organisations have no transparency or visibility about the quality and quantity of coaching happening inside their organisation. So we've been trying to overcome this for years with coaching logs, and they were good for a while, but then version control was a pain and pages would fall out of binders in retail outlets. So in the end, we said, let's build an app, and that's when we built YakTrack. And so YakTrack is now a software platform that provides that level of transparency. That means you can hold people accountable for really making sure that the quality and quantity of coaching is happening. And it just comes back to the old adage of what gets measured gets done, and coaching's no different.
Now, we spent a lot of time on frequency, but you did mention two other parts of that triangle, if you will, focus and quality. So where do they come in, Peter?
Well, I think once you've started to establish the frequency, then they probably have an equal billing. You know, once you're in the right spot and you're starting to have these conversations, well, let's improve the focus and let's improve the quality. But I'll start with focus because I think that is probably the most underrated leadership skill that we find, particularly in frontline leaders. Yeah, and let's face it, many frontline leaders haven't had a lot of experience and are often promoted from within their team. So it's a tough gig, yeah. But focus, as I said before, it's the ability to take an objective and translate it into a behaviour. If you cannot do this, you can't coach, because coaching is about changing behaviour, which then changes performance. But so many coaches will be coaching on something like, you know, Caitlin, you just need to build more rapport. Come on, build more rapport. Well, you know, half the people can't even spell it. It's a funny old word with two P's somewhere in it. And then the only helpful thing the coach is saying is build more rapport, which is actually an output measure anyway. It's not even a behaviour. So coaches need to be really good at working with the team member with some autonomy to translate that down into, well, what tiny thing could you do differently straight away to get you a little bit closer to that goal? And then that's the second point of focus, is not just selecting the behaviour, but getting micro behavioural, so that I can say to you, do everything you're doing currently, but just do this little bit differently. And when you do that, it means that can be implemented immediately. And then we get the benefit of that very quickly so that we can prove the value of coaching. And then that individual goes, wow, that little thing, God, that made a big difference. I actually don't mind this coaching thing. I might be more receptive to the coaching. And, you know, we did have a question, I think it was from Mark Dunk in prior, and he was talking about how do you coach people that don't want to be coached? Well, that's one of the ways to do it, is don't ask them to make a big change, just ask them to make a little and then prove the value, and then you earn the right to coach them a little bit more over time. So the focus is really critical there. And ultimately, the ongoing fuel that lights the fire in a coaching culture are all those little wins that you get every day from trying those tiny little new and different things. So that's the focus bit.
And I really imagine that, like you're saying, that it's those quick wins for a coachee makes them feel more motivated to change and go, as you said, like, this coaching is actually not too bad. I quite enjoy this. But I imagine from the coach's point of view as well, once they see those little wins coming from their coachee, suddenly they're a lot more invested and said, oh, this coaching thing is actually working. I can see how it's going to work. I can see it actually translating now into something that's going to change, and that's how that's going to aggregate into what performance measures I'm looking at. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of frontline leaders don't get a lot of training when they move in, so they're a really good individual contributor, and we promote them because of that. Yeah, oh, well, that's going to work. So they go and they might try having a coaching session with one of their peers, and it all feels very awkward. And if they don't get a result out of it, is there any wonder that I'm not that keen to coach? Yeah.
Yep.
And therefore I start to not be that disciplined. So you're spot on. It fuels both the coachee and the coach, and it really does provide that thing that keeps the whole coaching framework going.
Gives that momentum, get that little momentum going. So that leaves us with the final piece, Peter, quality. Tell us about quality and how that fits in.
Yeah, so the quality of the conversation that leaders are having with their team is obviously very important. So, what we need to do is be ensuring that we're having conversations that aren't too long. Most coaching sessions we see are way too long, and they cover way too many things, which of course overwhelms the coachee and then makes it almost impossible for them to successfully implement. Therefore, they don't get the feeling of affirmation and success. Therefore, they're more resistant the next time you try to go in there, yeah? So quality of coaching is about short, sharp, snappy conversations that enable people to understand the little thing that they could do immediately over a short time frame, and then ensuring that there's follow-up processes to make sure that what they're feeling as a result of that success starts to build the momentum going forward. So it's probably a little bit more about the process of coaching. And it's not just about the conversations, it's about what happens before, it's what happens during, and it's what happens after the coaching. So if we can get those little process elements right and get the coach demonstrating certain behaviours, then we know that combined with the focus and then combined with the frequency, we start to have this tactical leadership triangle that is all self-supporting, and then we can really start creating a coaching culture.
Yeah, so I'm having really focused, quality conversations frequently, and I'm nailing then that sort of coaching culture across the board. Be fair to say.
Yeah, and that gives everyone the wins that you need to start believing that this thing actually works, and then the whole thing starts to catch on fire and go away with itself, and then the culture becomes sustainable.
Right. Now, I've seen there's a lot of questions that have been popping up in the chat as we've been talking, and I know we had a few emailed into us before the webinar. Kate, I'm going to pass across to you because you've been monitoring the chat. What have we got for Peter?
Right. Yeah, people have been a bit shy, so please, this is your chance to pop in your questions if you do have any for Peter, but we'll begin with going through the ones that have come through prior to the session on email. So I've got a question here, Peter, from Kim Park from Bank of Queensland. And she'd like some tips on how to conduct constructive coaching conversations with her team when onboarding and training new staff members.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Kim. We've been talking today a little bit more at a high level about a coaching culture, yeah. But really, Kim, what you'll be trying to do is really trying to set up a coaching culture within your own team. So everything that we've been speaking about today actually applies just as well to an individual leader, yeah. But what I would point out that if you're trying to coach people who are new, then the frequency needs to be higher, and then the size of the change you're asking them needs to be smaller. Yeah. So this system of way of coaching, which is high frequency, clear about the outputs that we're trying to achieve, translating those into a tiny little thing I could do, it might not even be a day. Just try that over the next hour, and particularly say if it was in customer conversations. And then doing really good quality conversations, it's still the answer to that. So all those three elements are very applicable. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about a whole culture or an individual team.
Yeah, absolutely. Just apply it to every conversation. Yeah.
Yep.
Fantastic. And we've got one here also from Lee Sellers, who wants to know a little bit about the current status of organisational coaching and corporates actually seeing the value in coaching.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because every organisation we talk to would admit that coaching is a good thing, yeah? And then you would say to them, okay, well, let's go and have a look at the coaching that's happening inside your organisation. Let's have a look at how often it's actually being cancelled, yeah? So they say coaching's important, but many of them don't actually demonstrate coaching's importance by where they put their budget, but also by where they encourage leaders to spend their time, yeah? Now, the organisations that are doing really well with regard to retention, achieving objectives, and really building the capability of their team with great engagement scores are the ones that are putting more emphasis on coaching. So, they'll make coaching a key responsibility for all levels of leadership in the organisation, like I said before. They'll invest in training people to actually know how to coach, and then they'll also invest in systems and processes required to actually make sure that we're tracking it and that it's being measured. But in answer to your question, Lee, I still think coaching is way undervalued, and particularly right now on the back of COVID, where organisations tend to be running over budget on operational expenditure due to inefficiencies for all sorts of reasons. Spending time developing coaches is certainly being underinvested in at the moment.
Yeah, great. And we have got one new one in the chat. We've got Jake Little, who wants to know if you can talk a little bit about how to celebrate the little victories, in micro-behavioural change.
The very, very first thing is just be there. Just be there. It's think about the things that have the most impact on you personally. They are those, it usually doesn't relate to money. It doesn't necessarily relate to a massive gesture. It can just be that someone took the time to just notice, yeah? That doesn't matter whether it's, stopping and having a chat to your neighbour, or, if you've got young kids, actually just finding the time when they're at you all the time to just sit down and be a little bit present with them. The biggest thing I could say is by getting people to do little things over short time frames, making sure you're available at the end of that time frame and demonstrate genuine interest in how did you go, and they go, wow, high five. It's just those simple things, and you put enough of those together and it'll start to make the big things. And then you can do more formal things around the big things. You might take people away, you might give them a movie voucher, you might recognise them in front of your team, all of those sorts of things. But the main thing is to be present and be there when the little success has been had. That's the number one thing, yeah? And it doesn't cost anything.
Yeah, absolutely. That positive affirmation, just being recognised, goes a long way, doesn't it?
It does, especially when, you know, I've been doing something the same way for a long period of time, and sort of you've encouraged me to try something different. I'm a little bit nervous about it, and then I have a go and oh, it worked. Whoa! I want to tell someone about it. Be there for that, and that's all you'll need to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also about celebrating, you know, those coaches, those team members that are always do a great job, and noticing that too.
Yeah. And of course, the other thing I should say, not always does everything work. So you need to be there if it didn't work as well, because you need to understand why and then provide the inspiration to give them another go, or maybe change things up a little bit. So it's just important to be there, yeah, as a leader, and make that time.
Great. Well, that looks like all of the questions we've got for now. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us today. I hope that everybody who's come along today has caught some of your excitement for coaching, and that they take it away with them and spread it far and wide next year. So thanks again. If you have any more questions that you didn't sort of pop in the chat or didn't email prior to this, please do send them through to us, and we can forward them to Peter, and we'll absolutely get you some answers, and so you can delve a little bit deeper and improve your coaching. And of course, thank you to Caitlin, who has done an amazing job of articulating some really insightful questions. That's probably why nobody followed up, well, not many follow-up questions, because you just answered them all for us.
I must have nailed it.
We must have done such a good job. Yeah.
No worries. Well, thank you, Kate. Thank you so much for everyone that took the time to come on. This is something that we're very passionate about, and if we can spread the love around coaching culture, then we're happy to do it in whatever way we can. So thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so there are contact details up on the screen there. So again, any more questions and anything about, you know, the GRIST methodology or just coaching in general, please do contact us. And if you want to dig a little bit deeper into some of our previous coaching webinars, they're all up on our website in the news section. So just grist.com.au/news. We'll be continuing this coaching series next year. So please do subscribe to our monthly email or join our LinkedIn on or Facebook, and we'll absolutely keep you informed on all upcoming webinars. And finally, on behalf of GRIST, I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and wish you a very Merry Christmas and have a great break. And we look forward to seeing everybody next year. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.